尽管中国人常说新疆自古以来属于中国，但如果真是如此，恐怕就不会有新疆这个名字了。新疆问题远比其他任何中国少数民族问题都更加复杂。从蒙古大草原穿越新疆到中亚地区的这块广袤的土地，曾是突厥人世代数千年居住的家园。历史上，突厥是维吾尔、哈萨克、柯尔克孜等多个突厥游牧民族祖先的总称。与作为后来迁徙到这个区域的汉民族相比，他们对新疆的认知有着天渊之别。自秦汉开始，在几千年的历史长河中，内地的王朝与突厥民族大多都在征战状态。由于突厥从北部对中原造成经常性的威胁，汉唐两代分别在抵抗突厥的过程中，采用同样的军事策略及驻扎西域，以切断突厥进攻中原的命脉。因此，在今天的新疆地区驻军。中国官方常常称新疆从此变成了中国的一个部分，但这样的说法没有得到过历史学界的肯定。更多的说法是，双方仍旧各自独立，并没有主次之分。中国的疆域并没有因为驻军而得到扩充。
But they were dots on the map, and often they weren't held very long. For example, some of the outposts in northern Xinjiang were only held for a couple of decades or less during the Tang period, as part of an ongoing on-again, off-again war with various nomadic groups.
这位是美国乔治城大学史学专家米华进教授，他与乔治华盛顿大学人类学家肖恩罗伯兹教授是为数不多的新疆问题的权威专家，在新疆历史和社会问题上都进行过透彻的考察和研究。
And indeed, many of those soldiers in the Tang armies were themselves nomads. They were themselves Turkic peoples. In fact, one of the reasons that that the Uyghurs in Xinjiang speak a Turkic language today is because of that movement of Turkic peoples and Turkic soldiers under Tang command. So the Tang dynasty actually helped to Turkicize Xinjiang. That's not something most people know.
即便是短暂的驻军，也在唐末安史之乱之后全面撤出。从8世纪往后的1000年左右时间里，中原与西域几乎断绝往来。维吾尔民族本身则经历了从回鹘汗国、卡拉汗王朝、高昌回鹘王国以及伊尔羌汗国几个朝代的变化，足迹遍布蒙古草原至中亚地区，创造出自己辉煌的文明。直到19世纪后半叶清朝鼎盛时期，满清帝国才发现北部蒙古的准噶尔汗国透过西域地区与西藏连成一片，一旦形成联盟，将对中原形成半面包围之势。
So it was important both for the Kangxi Emperor and his successor Yongzheng, and then the Qianlong Emperor, to be able to control those areas, to control the loyalty of Mongols, to control the loyalty of Tibetan Buddhists wherever they are, both in Mongolia and Tibet.
平定准噶尔之役，历经康熙、雍正、乾隆3朝70年，终于在乾隆年间大获全胜，一举在天山南北拓地2万余里，并将这一地区改名为新疆，意思就是新的疆域。中国史书将此记载成乾隆帝的丰功伟绩，列入乾隆帝10全武功之首，但基本不提新疆本地百姓对清朝政府的抵抗。
It actually encountered a lot of resistance from the local population in that process, and even about 100 years after the conquest, the local population pushed the Qing out of the region entirely. And that lasted for about 30 years, and then the Qing came back in 1880s, and that's really the period where you see this region become attached to the idea of a modern China.
1884年，光绪帝在新疆建省，因此所谓新疆自古是中国的一部分，最多也就是一个半世纪的历史。不仅时间不长，而且怎样定义中国的一部分也都极具争议。现代的中国政府当然认为清政府与新疆的关系不可分割，但维吾尔学者则普遍认为新疆依然处于殖民下的相对独立状态。 抛开双方的民族情绪，西方学者的看法是，在分析清帝国与本地政府的关系和特点，并与世界其他国家对比之后做出的评判。
In the second period after the Qing dynasty comes back in to the region in the later 19th century, then you see some policies that look more like European colonialism.
So nowadays, to say that Xinjiang is a Chinese colony, or to say even that it was a Qing colony, that's seen as an attack on China. It's often said to be, a politicized attack by foreign critics of China. Right? So remember, in those days, colonialism was not a dirty word. It was something that the great powers were all trying to do.
And there's an attempt to promote the Chinese language among the local population. There's attempts to kind of incorporate them into the officialdom system, taking exams and so on. But by most accounts of most historians, it wasn't that successful.
从清政府到民国时期，杨增新、金树人、盛世才等军阀政府，再到社会主义的苏维埃政府，直到20世纪初，对新疆的统治在各大势力之间游移，对本地人造成极大困扰和伤害。100多年之间，维吾尔人反压迫、要尊严，大大小小争取本民族独立的运动不下几十起，从未放弃。1933年，维吾尔等突厥民族反抗军阀，在新疆南部第一次建立东突厥斯坦伊斯兰共和国。然而几个月之后就被苏联协助下的军阀消灭。1944年，斯大林提供政治和武力后盾，支持维吾尔族和哈萨克族等各族人民独立，在新疆北部再一次建立了东突厥斯坦共和国。这一次，东突共和国建立起了完整的政府和军队，并得到当地民众的支持。
And that was much more secular in character, although its first president was actually a Muslim cleric. But it also adopted a lot of Soviet ideology. But it certainly was also propelled by the local population, who at that time, particularly in the area near Ili, they had a long history of very close relations with the Soviet Union, had positive views of the Soviet Union.
但由于二战之后，斯大林急于与共产主义阵营的新中国修好，很快的将东突共和国拱手相让。
With the success of the People's Republic of China, of the Communist Party in China in 1949, this created an interesting sort of problem because Soviet influence had been so strong in northern Xinjiang. It was similar in many ways to the Soviet position in Outer Mongolia, which of course resulted in Outer Mongolia declaring independence and becoming an independent state, although a satellite of the Soviet Union. But the calculus was just a little bit different in Xinjiang, and Stalin determined to let it recede back into Chinese control.
中共对这段历史称作三区革命，宣传的口径是三区革命是近代史上具有重大历史意义的民族民主革命运动，为新疆和平解放创造有利条件。但同时，国民党控制的南疆还在与斯大林支持的中共进行殊死抵抗，并渐渐败下阵来。
And Jiang Jieshi, who had of course by this time fled to Taiwan, he told his generals there to fight to the last man against the communist bandits. They made a different decision, and the Kuomintang leaders fled over the passes into India. But of course, all of the soldiers were left there, these Kuomintang soldiers.
中共占领整个新疆地区，安顿国民党余下的10万残兵，成了亟待解决的问题。
So these 100,000 Kuomintang troops became the core of what became the Xinjiang Shengchang Jianshe Bingtuan. They were taken under communist control and settled and set to work as farmers. And of course, they were mainly men, and there were no women out there, or no Han women. And so there was a movement very soon in the 1950s to find them wives so that they could settle down. And a lot of women were moved from Shanghai and other places in eastern China out there to be wives for these former Kuomintang soldiers.
很快，中共建立中华人民共和国，宣称和平解放新疆。但是，新疆真的是被和平解放的吗？ 新中国成立之前的1949年8月，东土共和国核心领导人以及各方愿与中共合作的人士一同登上了前往北京的飞机，与中共谈判。
And so the leadership of what had been the Second East Turkestan Republic were all sent to go to that conference in Beijing. And they got on a plane and flew towards Beijing.
Most of its leaders were supposed to go visit Mao Zedong. There was a mysterious airplane crash, the details of which are not that well known, where most of the leadership died.
And so the Turkic leadership, for reasons that remain a mystery, completely disappeared.
东土共和国领袖无一生还，政府瞬间瓦解。塞夫丁·艾泽兹签字，不提任何独立或是关于民族自决的要求，将主权完全移交中共。东土的民族军被改编为解放军，将领被解职。塞夫丁本人被中共尊为受命于危难之时的维吾尔族人民的优秀儿子，也被维吾尔人当作卖国求荣的叛徒。新疆问题真正是由来已久，正如作家王立雄先生所说：“我的西域，你的东土。”有些维吾尔人至今仍坚称这片土地是东突厥斯坦，而不愿接受新疆称谓，因为他们依然坚持着对自己家园的守护和抗争。这些人被中共称为疆独。隔着千年风霜，维汉恩怨本就扑朔迷离。太多的情绪，太多的政治卷入其中，彼此有太多误解。再加上中国政府有意的屏蔽，学者不明就里的解读，让无知者恐惧，被当权者利用，为维汉矛盾的加剧深深地埋下种子。